The thing about the bottom was the sound. And on the night it stopped, Wade Tillery knew it before he knew anything else. He stood on the back steps with a mason jar of cold coffee in his hand and waited for the bottom to do what it had done every warm night of his 41 years. The Chuckwill's widow should have been working the far fence line. The cricket wall should have been climbing up out of the switchgrass. The frogs down at the slough should have been laying their flat repeating note across the dark. He counted to 30 in his head the way his daddy had taught him to count thunder, and the bottom gave him nothing. Not a single voice came up out of the trees. The water still moved, because water always moved, but the things that lived beside the water had gone quiet, and quiet down here had a weight to it. Wade was not a man who scared easy, and he would have told you so without any heat in it. He kept the pumps running for a poultry operation that ran 4 houses up the rise, and a man who keeps pumps running learns to read a thing by its sound long before a gauge tells him anything. He could stand in the dark and tell you a bearing was going by the pitch of it. He could tell you a belt was slipping from across the yard. He could put his hand on a casing and feel a cavitation he could not yet hear and know. He had a day, maybe 2, before the impeller chewed itself apart. He trusted his ears the way other men trusted their eyes, and his ears were telling him the bottom had emptied of everything that should be singing in it. He stood there a while longer, past the count of 30, into a count he stopped keeping, and the silence did not break. The water moved. The rain that had not yet come hung somewhere out over the gulf and pushed a warm, wet weight up the bottom ahead of it. Nothing sang. He poured the cold coffee off the step into the grass and went back inside, and did not say anything to Lena, because there was nothing yet to say, and because a man who says a thing out loud has started to believe it. The house was a low brick ranch. His granddad had set on the only high shelf of the 11 acres, 3 rooms across the back and a kitchen that ran the width of the front. And Wade had been raised in it, and had buried the old man out of it, and had brought Lena into it the year the bean prices were good. He knew the give of every floorboard. He knew which cabinet door hung crooked, and which faucet had to be cranked hard left before it would quit dripping. He knew, without thinking, that the house ticked and settled a certain way as it cooled at night, the way an old house does. And he knew the difference between a house talking to itself and a sound that came from outside it. That difference was about to become the most important thing he owned. His wife was at the kitchen table with the baby monitor turned low, folding the small things that came out of the dryer in a pile that never seemed to shrink. Their daughter was 9 months old and slept in the back room with the window that looked down toward the tree line. Her name was Maisie, and she had come 3 weeks early on a January night when the bottom road was sheeted with ice, and Wade had driven it at 15 miles an hour with both hands cramping on the wheel and his wife breathing through it in the seat beside him, and he had not been afraid then the way he was learning to be afraid now. Because that night the danger had a name and a hospital at the end of it. Lena had a way of folding a sleeper with her thumbs that made it into a flat little square, and she did 3 of them, while Wade rinsed the jar and set it in the rack. The monitor put a soft wash of static into the room. The sound of a sleeping child's breathing carried up a hall on a cheap radio. A sound so ordinary, he had stopped hearing it months ago. She asked him if the dogs up at the houses were carrying on again, and he said no. They were quiet too, and she heard something in how he said it, and looked up. The dryer ticked as it cooled. He told her it was nothing. He believed it was nothing. He had a lot of nights left to spend learning how wrong that was. The place sat on 11 acres. His granddad had bought back when land down here went cheap because nobody wanted bottom ground that flooded. The creek ran the western edge of it, low and tea-colored, sliding through a stand of water oak and sweet gum, and the kind of cane that grew up thick enough to lose a dog in. Mossy Creek had a name on the county map, and no name anybody used, and the bottom where it widened out below the house was the part nobody farmed and nobody hunted hard, because the footing went to black muck the second you stepped off the high ground. Wade had run that bottom his whole life. He knew where the old crossing was, where the hogs wallowed, where the deer cut through on their way to the bean field east of the property. He knew it the way you know the inside of your own mouth without thinking. And that was why what came next landed on him the way it did. It started with the dogs at the chicken houses, not his dogs. The operation kept 2 yellow curs that lived to bark at headlights and coyotes in the propane truck. A pair of rangy half-feral things named Buck and Sister that the house's owner fed but never touched, and they ran the whole rise as their territory and gave Wade grief every morning of his working life. Charging the truck and falling away from the tires at the last second the way curs do. For 2 nights running, they would not leave the slab under the equipment shed. Wade went up before dawn to prime the lines and found both of them pressed flat to the concrete, with their bellies down and their ears back and their lips working off their teeth, without any sound coming out, and they would not come to him, and they would not take the scrap he held out, and they would not look at the tree line. Buck had wet himself where he lay. Wade stood there with his light and ran it along the edge of the cane and saw nothing but cane. The long stand of it going gray-green, and then black as the beam fell off into the bottom. The dogs knew something he didn't, and that bothered him more than a sound would have, a sound he could chase down. This was the absence of one, and the absence had a direction to it, and the direction was. He primed his lines with the dogs flat behind him, and his back to the cane the whole time, and he did not like having his back to it, and that was new. He found the first track on a Thursday, in the soft ground where the pump discharge kept a patch of the yard wet year-round. He almost stepped in it. He crouched and put his light on it, and felt the back of his neck go cool in a way that had nothing to do with the morning. The print was long. He laid his hand beside it out of habit, the way you measure anything in the field, and it ran longer than his spread hand by a good 2 inches. And his hands were not small. It showed 4 toes and a heel pad, and at the front of each toe a deep point where a claw had gone into the mud and dragged a dog track. Does that. A big dog. The proportions were wrong, though. The pad too broad for the toe spread. And the thing that stopped his breath was the depth. The track sat a full inch deeper in the wet ground than his boot did when he stood next to it and pressed down with all his weight. Whatever had put it there carried more than he did, and he carried 210 pounds. He took a picture of it with his phone and hated, the second he looked at it, how the screen made the thing look small and ordinary, a smear of mud no bigger than a thumbnail. He told himself it was a hog. He knew it was not a hog. He told himself it was somebody's mastiff run loose, the way you tell yourself the easy thing while the hard thing sits there in the mud, refusing to be anything but what it is. A hog leaves a split track. This was no hog. A loose dog does not weigh what put that depth in the ground. He went up and primed his lines and came back at noon with a tape measure because the not knowing had gotten under his skin. And he laid the steel tape across the print and read 11 inches from the back of the heel to the tip of the longest claw drag. And he wrote it on the back of a feed receipt with a carpenter pencil because he was a man who wrote numbers down 11 inches. He sat on his heels in his own yard and looked at the number and at the tree line and did not go down into the bottom. That day Lena saw the picture that night and did the thing she always did, which was to ask the practical question first. She set down the dish towel and held his phone close to her face and turned it in the light, and she did not gasp. And she did not call it anything. She just looked at it the way she looked at a bill she meant to pay. She wanted to know if it could hurt the baby. Not whether it was real, not what it was, just whether it could come to the house. And Wade heard in that the whole shape of how she had already decided to handle this, which was the same way she handled a fever or a busted water heater, by figuring out the worst case and working backward. He told her dogs that size didn't come up to lit houses. She asked him if it was a dog. He did not answer that right away, and she watched him not answer it, and she handed the phone back and said she wanted a light on the corner by the baby's room, not the equipment shed, the baby's room, and she said it flat and final the way she said things she had already decided. He said he'd set one. She went back to the dishes, and he watched her shoulders and saw that they were not easy, and neither of them said anything else about it. He did not tell her about the depth of the track, or the way the dogs would not look at the cane or the wet patch where Buck had lain, because those were things he did not have words for yet that would not sound like a man losing his grip. And Wade had spent 41 years being a man who did not lose his grip. The light he set was a motion flood on the corner of the equipment shed, aimed down the slope toward the tree line, and the first night it threw its hard white wash across the yard 4 times between full dark and dawn. He sat up and watched it from the kitchen window each time, and each time he saw nothing in the light but the rain that had started up after midnight, the fine, warm drizzle that came up off the Gulf this time of year and hung in the air more than it fell, 4 times. Something was crossing the edge of the sensor's reach, close enough to trip it, far enough back to stay in the cane. By the 4th time, he had stopped telling himself it was the rain. Rain does not trip a sensor 4 times and leave the dogs flat on the slab. He stood at the glass with his rifle leaned in the corner where he could reach it, and watched the empty lit yard and felt the first real cold go through him. Not panic. Panic is loud. And this was not loud. This was a low, steady certainty settling into his chest like cold water finding the bottom of a tank. The next morning he found where it had stood. The motion light had a blind spot at the very edge of its throw, where the slope dropped toward the creek. And in that blind spot, in the soft black mud at the foot of a leaning sweet gum, the ground was printed deep, with the same long track, and not one of them but a place where the thing had stood and shifted its weight and stood again. The way a man stands when he is watching a house and waiting. Wade counted 9 clear prints in an area no bigger than a truck bed, the toes all pointed at the house. He stood in that spot and turned and looked back up the slope the way the thing would have looked, and he could see the kitchen window from there, lit and yellow. And he could see past the kitchen the smaller window of the back room where his daughter slept, and he understood that whatever had stood here had been able to see it too. He called the county that morning. He was not a man who called the county for much, and the dispatcher took his name and his road and asked him what the nature of the problem was, and Wade stood in his yard with the phone hot against his ear and tried to put it into words that would not get him written down as a crank. He said he had a large predator coming up to his house at night. He said he had tracks, clear ones, and he had photographs. The dispatcher asked if anyone was hurt, and he said no. And she said an animal complaint would go to the game warden's office, and she'd pass it along. He asked her how long that might take. She said she couldn't say. He could hear under her flat courtesy the soft clatter of a keyboard, the sound of it already becoming a piece of paper sliding into a stack of paper. And he knew that nobody was coming, and that he was on his own with it the way the people down in this bottom had always been on their own. He thanked her because his mother had raised him to thank people. And he hung up and looked at the tree line and knew he would not be calling again. The phone in his hand felt like exactly what it was, which was a thing that connected him to people who were all somewhere else. The game warden did call back. 2 days later, a younger man named Pruitt, with an easy phone voice, who had clearly handled 100 of these. He asked the right questions. He asked about hogs, about the neighbor's dogs, about whether Wade had been baiting deer. He offered the explanations one after another, the way you'd hand a man tools out of a box, and Wade caught each one and turned it over and handed it back, because he had already tried every one of them himself in the long hours at the window. A hog leaves a split track. The neighbor's curs were the ones lying flat on the slab. He wasn't baiting. Pruitt went quiet for a second on the line, and then he said he'd try to come out and have a look when he got a free morning. And they both knew what that meant. And it was nobody's fault. And it left Wade standing in his kitchen with the phone in his hand and the whole weight of the thing back on his own shoulders where it had been all along. That was the week. The bottom got loud. Again, but wrong. The singing did not come back. The frogs stayed silent, and the chuckwill's widow did not work. The fence in the cricket wall never rebuilt itself, and the bottom kept that held breath quiet. It had taken on the first night. What came back instead was movement. Wade started hearing it after midnight, a heavy passage through the cane that no deer made, because a deer in cane sounds like a deer. A quick startled crash, and then nothing. And this was not that. This was slow. This was something pushing through the stand at a walk, taking its time. The cane bending and dragging along a body and springing back. Not trying to be quiet exactly, but not caring whether it was heard. And it would move along the tree line from the south end of the property to the north and back, a patrol, a circuit. And Wade would track it by sound from window to window, with his rifle in his hand, and his heart going steady and hard. There was a rhythm to the passage. He noticed a long pause every so often, where the sound stopped entirely, and in those pauses he would stand frozen at whatever window he had reached, straining, and he came to understand that in those pauses the thing was standing still and listening for him the same way he was standing still and listening for it. That the two of them were doing the exact same thing on opposite sides of the glass. And that was the worst of it, that it hunted the way he hunted, that it had a patience he recognized. He timed it one night. 40 minutes from the first sound at the south fence to the last sound fading north. 40 minutes of something walking the edge of his land in the dark, in no hurry, between him and the creek, learning him the way he was learning it. He did the thing a competent man does. He hardened the place. He cut back the cane along the near edge with a bush hook until his hands blistered and broke and bled into the wood of the handle, working through the heat of 2 afternoons, opening a band of bare ground 40 feet wide between the tree line and the house. He raked the cut stalks into a pile and burned them, and watched the smoke lie flat in the wet air, and not rise. Well, he moved the baby's crib to the interior wall, away from the window, and felt foolish doing it and did it anyway. And Lena helped him without a word, and they wedged the dresser into the space where the crib had been, so the room would not look emptied to a thing that watched it. He set a second light on the far corner so the 2 floods together would leave less shadow. He went up to the houses and borrowed a coil of hog wire, and ran it along the base of the cut band, and staked it down, knowing as he drove the stakes that it would not stop anything that left that depth in the mud, knowing it was a fence a man builds to feel his own hands doing something. He loaded the rifle, a bolt-action .30-06 that had been his granddad's, and had killed nothing bigger than a coyote in his hands, and stood it by the door and put a box of shells on the shelf above it where Lena could reach but the baby never could. He checked the latches on every window in the house, twice a night, the back room first. Always the back room first, and he did it in a fixed order, so he would notice if anything was out of place. And for a few nights the order held and nothing was out of place, and he let himself believe the cut cane and the lights and the wire had pushed it back. They had not pushed it back. They had only taught it to wait. The smell came before the worst of it. Wade was a man who had cleaned out a dead pump house full of drowned rats in August, who had pulled a calf that had died inside its mother and not made a face doing it. And he knew rot, and this was not rot. This was a rank, musky wet dog and something under its smell, a thick animal stink with a sourness running through it like meat left in a hot truck, and it rolled up the slope on the night air and filled the back room when he went in to check the window. And the first time it hit him, he stood over his sleeping daughter and felt every hair on his arm stand up at once. It was the smell of a big animal that had been in the rain. It was the smell of something that had been standing close enough to the house for its scent to carry in through the gap under the old window sash where the glazing had pulled away from the frame years ago, and he had never gotten around to fixing. He put his hand flat on the glass, and it was cold. Colder than the night should have made it, and beyond it the cut band of ground was empty and pale under the floodlight, the hog wire throwing its thin grid of shadow, and the smell was as strong as if the thing were in the room with him. He understood that it had been at the glass on the other side, near enough to breathe on it, and had moved off only when his own footsteps came down the hall. He stood there a long time with his hand on the cold glass and made himself breathe slow and counted the seconds between his own heartbeats and could not get them to slow down. He found the hair the next morning, caught in the rough cedar of the window frame at a height that stopped him cold. He had to reach up to pull it free. The windowsill stood at 4 feet, and the hair was snagged a good 2 feet above that, near 6 feet off the ground, where nothing on 4 legs leaves hair. It was coarse and dark and longer than his finger, with a paler base, a guard, hair off something with a heavy coat, and he sealed it in a sandwich bag the way he'd seen done on the television shows, because he did not know what else to do with a thing that should not exist. And he wrote the date on the bag in carpenter pencil, and the height he'd pulled it from, 5 feet 8 inches. And he put it in the truck where Lena would not find it, and asked the question he could not answer. Something had stood at that window, on its hind legs, something tall enough to look down into the room. He did not let himself finish the thought. He went and primed his lines, and his hands shook on the valves for the first time in his working life. The trail camera was Lena's idea, and it was a good one. And it failed the way everything failed against this. Wade had a hardwire cam he used to watch the deer in the bean field, and he pulled it and zip-tied it to the leaning sweet gum at the foot of the slope, aimed up at the cut band in the house. And he set it to fire on motion and saved to the card, and for 2 nights it caught nothing but the rain and a possum and the neighbor's curs slinking along the fence. On the 3rd night it caught 17 frames between 1 and 2 in the morning, and Wade sat at the kitchen table in the gray light with the card and the reader, and went through them one at a time, and his coffee went cold, and Lena stood behind him with her hand over her mouth. The first frames showed the cut band, empty, pale, the rain coming down fine and slanting. Then a frame with something at the very top edge, out of focus, too close to the lens to resolve, a mass that filled the upper corner, and threw the autofocus into a smear. Then a frame that was nothing but that smear, closer. Then the eyes. 2 points of light low and level and wide set, catching the infrared and throwing it back flat and silver. And the spacing of them was the thing that made Lena make the sound she made, because the eyes were too far apart. Wade had photographed enough deer and coon and bobcat to know what eye spacing meant on the card, to know the size of a head by the gap between the shine. And this gap was a hand's width, the eyes of something with a skull wider than any dog that ever lived. And they were not low to the ground the way an animal's eyes ride. They were up. They were 4.5 feet off the ground and looking straight into the lens, and behind them, in the same frame, you could just make out the line of a heavy shoulder rising higher still. and then the last frames were the smear again. The camera died that night. He found it the next morning with the strap torn and the case cracked and the lens packed with mud, hanging by one zip tie, and the card, when he checked, held nothing past frame 17. He stopped sleeping after that. He would lie down when the sky started to gray and get 2 or 3 hours, while Lena watched from the kitchen, with the rifle across her knees and a cup of coffee she did not drink. And the rest of the night he spent at the windows, moving the rifle from room to room, learning the thing circuit the way it had learned his house. He kept a record of it on the back of the feed receipts because keeping records was the one thing he had left that felt like control. South fence at 12:40, tree line passage by 12:50. The pause at the leaning sweet gum. The smell at the back window between 1 and 1:30, every night now. Regular as a shift change. He filled 3 receipts with times and dragged them out on the table in the morning, and looked at the pattern, and the pattern was a thing closing in by inches. The back window, time creeping earlier, the pause at the window growing longer, the smell getting into the room faster after he left it. He was charting the approach of a thing the way he would chart the failing of a bearing, and he knew how that story ended, because a bearing that has started to go does not get better. It only tells you how long you have. Because that was the part that had crawled all the way into him by now. The part he could not put down. It had learned the house. It knew which window was the baby's. It had stood at that window. It had found the camera and killed it and left the rest of his gear alone. The deer feeder and the water trough float, and the spare cam still up in the bean field all untouched, which meant it had not destroyed the camera because it destroyed things. It tested the cut band, and it tested his patience, and it tested every single night the exact limit of how close it could come before the light tripped and the man came down the hall. And every night it found that limit a little nearer the glass. He stopped calling it a dog in his own head. He stopped calling it anything. There was no word that fit it that did not also make him a man who used words like that, and so he just watched it and tracked it and measured what it left and waited for the night it would stop testing. The neighbor up the rise, an old man named Castell, who had run cattle in the bottom 60 years and buried 2 wives and never once in Wade's memory, said an unnecessary word, came down to the fence one evening. He had heard the way people in a bottom hear that Wade was having trouble. He did not ask what kind. He looked down at the tree line a long while, his jaw working slow on nothing, the light going copper and then gray behind him. And then he told Wade that his daddy had pulled the cattle off the bottom ground the year Castell was born and never put them back. And that the old man had given a reason that Castell had laughed at as a boy and had not laughed at for some years. Now Wade asked him what the reason was. Castell did not answer that directly. He said there were stretches of this creek that the deer would not bed in and the dogs would not follow a track into, and that he had walked this bottom his whole life, and there were maybe 40 acres of it down past the old crossing that he had not set foot on since he was a young man, only that his feet would not carry him there. He said that every so often, a generation apart, maybe more, something would come up out of the deep bottom in a wet year and stand at the edge of where people lived, and stand there a while and then be gone, and the bottom would go back to being just a bottom. He said his daddy had lost a man once, a hired hand who went down into the cane after whatever it was, with a rifle and a lantern and good intentions, and that they had found the lantern and the rifle and never found the man, and that the only thing the old man had ever told Castell to do about it was to bring everything that mattered inside and put your back to a wall and wait for it to pass. Because it always passed, he said. The ones who waited it out, it passed them by. The ones who went down into the cane after it, did not always come back to say whether it had. Then Castell put his hat